In woodworking, there are various tips and tricks you can explore to further your knowledge. However, in my opinion, finding tips and tricks that are actually useful, then learning how to perform those tips and tricks using your tools, and then finding a project or process where you can actually implement that tip, it's quite difficult. I believe it is far more effective to understand the principles and the fundamentals of any given process in woodworking. In this instance, using a marking gauge, because understanding a process is far more effective than simply relying on an accumulation of random tips and tricks you've picked up. This will allow you to work more efficiently, more safely, and of course more accurately as well. So with that in mind, let's get into principle number 1, which is uses and limitations of a marking gauge. Now, in reality, these things are so essential and so versatile that it's impossible to list all of their uses in this section. But once you understand the basics of these things, you won't be able to put them down. You'll find uses for them everywhere. But the basic use of these is to mark a parallel line, or sometimes lines, plural, from an edge or a face. For example, here we've got a piece of wood that is very clearly tapered along its length. If we wanted to get this parallel, we could do something like measure a line up here, measure a line up here, connect them and then cut away the excess using whatever method. Or you could simply set a marking gauge to the width of the material you want and then just drag it back. And that is going to scratch a parallel line from your reference edge here. Similarly, if we're wanting to thickness this board by hand and the 80mm it's currently at is a bit too thick, we could set a marking gauge to 75mm, scratch that up from the bottom, and that is going to give us a nice line that we can plane back to. In fact, we could scratch that line around all 4 faces. Or if you wanted to do something like plotting a 5mm chamfer around all 4 edges of this, scratch it around all 4 faces of the top, scratch it around the sides, and then you've got 8 beautiful lines you can plane back to. But despite this tool's only function being able to mark parallel lines, it's so versatile you'll find esoteric uses for it all over the place. For example, finding center of a block like this. If you mark from all 4 edges, even with the gauge set so roughly, it's going to make it much easier to find center of a block like this. The limitations of these tools is, firstly, they mark an actual line in the material, which could be a problem if you're plotting full-size rigid orthographic drawings, in which case there's a thing called a pencil gauge, which is exactly the same, but instead of a knife or a point, it's a pencil. And sometimes you're limited by the length of the stock. If you want to be able to scratch a line that's further than that distance, you can't do it. In which case you'd want to get a larger marking gauge, which are often called panel gauges. Which leads very nicely onto the next section, which is selection. Now we've got 3 types of gauge here. The first one is what's referred to as an actual marking gauge. That's this one here. We'll go through it in a minute. Then we've got what's referred to as cutting gauges, which are these 3 here. And then we've got these 2 left over, which are called mortise gauges. Now marking gauge is a term that's used across the board for tools like this. However, given there's a few different types, the word marking gauge isn't quite specific enough. You need to be able to differentiate it more than that. And so we'll get onto these 2 later, but for now, if we're talking about an actual marking gauge, it's this one. A true marking gauge uses a pin to mark a line. Commonly, it's a conical point like this, but sometimes people will grind flats and different dimensions onto it to make it cut different. But if we want to be specific, a marking gauge is a gauge with a pin in it. And these are primarily used for marking a line along the grain like this. A pin like this is often said to follow the grain slightly less, which, as you'll see later, is something I dispute. But overall, the line it provides is pretty nice and clear. What you don't want to be doing with a marking gauge like this is marking across the grain, because it gets a little bit teary. This is why some people will change the geometry of the pin in these marking gauges, or they'll purchase a tool which is actually made for the job, which is a cutting gauge. A cutting gauge has a single bevel knife in it rather than a pin, which makes it far cleaner at cutting across the grain. So this is a very traditional cutting gauge. However, modern versions of these tend to look like this. They're sometimes called wheel marking gauges, but fundamentally they're still cutting gauges. They have a single bevel blade on the end, but they can be used over the entire circumference rather than just a single point. And like the cutting gauge, they are very good at cutting across the grain. And so that's the difference up close. Here we've got the marking gauge with a pin. This is the traditional style cutting gauge, and this is the modern style cutting gauge, often referred to as a wheel marking gauge. Just a quick side note on these wheel marking gauges. Even though they're called a wheel marking gauge, it doesn't mean the cutter needs to spin like a wheel. You actually want it to be fixed in place. If the wheel is spinning, it also means it's going to be wobbling slightly, which is obviously going to throw your layout lines off. So make sure it's fixed in position, and if you start seeing wear in one area of that blade, either loosen it, spin it round, or simply hold the gauge in a different orientation to what you've been doing. It's often said that cutting gauges cannot be used to mark along the grain like we've done with the pin style marking gauge here, because apparently a cutting gauge tracks the grain more than a pin gauge does. I have never found that to be the case. It largely comes down to technique. I find the main disadvantage to working along the grain with a cutting gauge like this is that the line gets lost in the grain a little bit easier than the pin marking gauge does. That's just the nature of using a tool with a single bevel on one side and a flat on the other, versus a pin marking gauge that leaves a V groove. And so if you can only get one of these gauges, my advice would be to get a cutting gauge, whether it's a traditional one like this, or if it's a more modern wheel marking gauge like this. With these, you'll be able to cut very cleanly across the grain, and with the techniques I'm going to share with you later, you'll be able to mark along the grain without it tracking. One advantage to a traditional style cutting gauge like this is that you can take this wedge out and flip the blade the other way round and lock it back in position. This puts the bevel on the opposite side of the knife, so that if you're marking out joinery like dovetails, for example, when you scratch along here, the bevel is on the material you're removing, like this, rather than on the side you want to keep. Generally speaking, this could be a limitation of these wheel marking gauges in which the cutter can only be oriented one way. But saying that, in my opinion, this has many more advantages that far outweigh the one negative it has against a traditional style like this. They tend to cut a little bit cleaner because the shape of the wheel kind of eases it into the cut rather than just goes straight in like a V-pointed knife like this. If for whatever reason you damage the cutter, you can just unscrew it and replace it with a new one. For storage and protection, the cutter can be tucked away into the head of the gauge, and it's got a few other cool uses like a micro adjust, and in the case of this one, it has graduations on the rod, so I can measure an offset using the gauge itself rather than needing to get a ruler against it. This is one of my favorite tools that I highly recommend, so if you're interested in it, I've put a link in the description. Moving on to mortise gauges now, these are defined as marking gauges with two cutters instead of one. Saying that, traditional ones sometimes have a marking gauge built into the back anyway, so you can actually use it as a normal marking gauge. But a mortise gauge has two pins, so you can simultaneously mark both sides of a tenon or a mortise at once. You can get more modern versions of this as well. For example, this is a wheel mortise gauge, and conveniently they flipped the bevel on one of these blades so that you can keep the bevel on the waste side of material. Generally speaking, when using these, I like to use the cutters one at a time. Trying to do them both like that is just a bit of a balancing act. And so if you are interested in one of these wheel style marking gauges, but you're worried about the fact you can't flip the blade over to put the bevel on the other side, consider grabbing one of these mortise gauges instead. Just because it has two blades on there, it doesn't mean you need to use them both. You can use this as a normal marking gauge and use one of them if you want the bevel on one side, or use the other if you want the bevel on the other. The only drawback is that it's just a little bit more cumbersome. That's it. And so to summarize this section, the pin marking gauge, which is the true marking gauge in this entire lineup, is primarily used for cutting with the grain. A cutting gauge, whether you get a traditional one like this or a wheel marking gauge, is primarily used for cutting across the grain, but don't feel too pigeonholed with that, because as you'll see in the next section, with proper technique, it's easy to get these to cut with the grain. And then finally, if you want all-round versatility at the slight expense of ergonomics, one of these wheel-style marking gauges where you've got two heads with a bevel on one side and a bevel on the other is going to cover all grounds for you. Let's move on to technique next. So firstly, remember that marking gauges are very sharp. Just because it's not a chisel or a knife or a saw, don't let that create a lapse in your concentration when using this tool. I've seen and I've heard of many pretty horrendous injuries from some of these tools. I would always recommend marking out on an elevated surface like this so you can mark down into the bench while keeping your fingers nice and clear. It's when people hold them in their hands like this that issues start to arise, because as you're trying to cut the line, you're pushing down into the material, which is pulling this hand up to counteract it, and so you're putting in way more pressure than you need to, and then you slip and you catch your thumb on the opposite side. Very, very common injury with these. Put it down on a bench, keep your thumbs nice and clear, and I prefer to focus on doing lots of successive passes rather than one big one. This is not only from a safety point of view, but I also find it just gives you a cleaner line. Now, as you saw just then, I like to pull the marking gauge towards me when cutting because I feel it gives me a little bit more control. But would you believe me if I said there are people out there who will tell you that pulling it is wrong and you need to push a marking gauge away from you? Well, you bet those people exist. Frustrates me saying it. If you've watched my video on how to plane correctly, this is very similar to the section where I talked about putting a plane down on its sole and how some people can get really butthurt about this for no reason whatsoever. This whole thing about pushing versus pulling a marking gauge is exactly the same. Don't concern yourself with it. Don't listen to it. It's a load of rubbish. The only time I've had an issue that remotely resembles this is when using these wheel marking gauges. If I drag towards me and that head isn't tight enough, it can actually loosen the screw and the head goes wobbly. But this is only a problem for me because I'm a left-hander and I pull the blade towards me. If I was a right-hander and I pulled the blade towards me, that would actually be tightening it into the stock, so I'll be doing myself a favor. On the other hand, if I was a left-hander and I pushed it, then I would be tightening the blade. That's the only issue I've ever come across with pushing versus pulling, but that's only going to be applicable to people like myself who are left-handed using this marking gauge and pulling it, or people who are the opposite of myself who are right-handed and push it. But even saying that, the easy solution is just to make sure that it's tight in the first place. Now let's talk about how to get an accurate, crisp line with a marking gauge, because this is the most important thing about a tool like this. Being able to use a marking gauge accurately is one of the foundations of clean, gap-free joinery, because if your initial lines with this are inaccurate, it doesn't matter how accurate you are with a chisel or a saw or anything afterwards, if your lines are inaccurate, everything else will be. So we need to make sure we get this right. The first thing that people do is they'll simply put too much pressure on the gauge when they're trying to cut the line. And if you do that, it starts wandering all over the place and you end up getting this horrible tearing across the grain. This is why I was saying earlier, it's often best to do lots of subsequent light passes rather than one big one. That's going to give you a much better line. Just look at the difference in that already. The other thing that it'll do is get the angle of attack completely wrong. Instead of going in perpendicular like this and tearing across the fibres, if you rest the gauge on the stock and then roll it forward until you feel the cutter engage with the wood, that's going to give you a really nice low angle of attack, and it's going to give you an absolutely beautiful line. And so you can see it on the left there, dramatic improvement from the first, slight improvement from the second. My general advice with a marking gauge is focus more on pushing the stock into the side of the material, whether that's end grain or side grain, than you are pushing down into the face. Because if you're focusing more on pushing into the face, then chances are it's just going to start tracking the grain and give you a ragged line. Whereas if you're focusing more on pushing into the side, not only is that going to mean the line is an accurate offset from that edge, but also it's going to encourage you to do lighter subsequent passes rather than one big one. So if you take anything from this section, make it be that. Focus on pushing the stock into the material rather than the blade. Cutting with the grain is a little bit more difficult because, as already discussed, the gauge has a tendency to track it along the length. And remember, this is regardless of whether you're using a cutting gauge, whether it's a modern one or a more traditional one like this, or if you're using a marking gauge with a pin. Because even if you use the tool that was designed for the job, if you use it incorrectly, it's still going to track the grain. And so when doing this, not only do you need to focus on the things I've just talked about, such as using light pressure and making sure that you're pushing into the side of the material more than you're pushing down, there's a couple of additional things you can do here to help you out. The first one is read the direction of the grain. At the moment, you can see that this is tracking off the end like this. And so if I wanted to mark a gauge line down here, as I pull it towards me, the gauge is going to want to drop into some of that softer grain, and it's going to start pulling it away like this. The same if I do it from this edge. As I drag back, it's going to start dropping into some of these softer bits, and it's going to start tracking off the edge. And so, to get around this, if I flip the material round and now drag it back towards me, which is my preference, if the cutter starts tracking some of this softer grain, it's actually not going to be able to do anything to the gauge because it's going to be pulling it in tighter, if anything, to the side of the material. It's almost as if you're intentionally working against the grain to get it to stick. So that's one quick technique you can use. Use the grain to your advantage so it helps pull the gauge into the side of the material, while of course doing the same things as I've said, light subsequent passes. If this doesn't work for you, however, and you find that it's still tracking the grain, one thing you can do here is, instead of trying to do the entire line all at once, focus on doing small sections at a time. If you start at the end here and drag back, in this case I'm only covering a distance of about an inch or so, which isn't enough distance to give the gauge enough time to follow the grain. And so now we've done a short pass like that, let's extend it 2 inches. We'll drag back. Again, I focused on a small section, but it's now fallen into the section before, and it's going to track that. Then we extend it again, create a new line, and then it falls into the previous one. Extend it again, drag back, extend it again, drag back, and keep doing that until the line goes the entire length of the wood. So effectively, you're creating a track for the next line to fall into. This also gives the added advantage of giving you lots of subsequent passes, so that line is nice and prominent, rather than trying to hit the whole thing in one hit and not only have the risk of tracking the grain, but also having to do subsequent passes over the entire thing to get the line deep enough. Using a marking gauge accurately primarily relies on patience. Light pressure, subsequent passes. But in addition to that, there is also a little sprinkling of technique required as well. such as making sure you're putting adequate pressure into the side of the material rather than down, making sure you're focusing on using the correct angle of attack with ones like this, and of course focusing on small sections of the line rather than hitting the entire thing at once. Tying all of these things together will dramatically improve your layout skills and will pay dividends with any later processes, whether it's sawing or chiseling or whatever. Accurate layout is the foundation of accurate woodworking. Now, as I've said, there is links to all the tools I recommend in the description below, and purchasing the tools using those links will give me a small commission at no extra cost to you. And while you're down there, be sure to visit mattisley.com/shop, where you can purchase t-shirts, hoodies, sweatshirts, stickers, plans. I've got all sorts of things available, and purchasing any of it helps keep these videos coming. So as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.